On the evening of October 26, 2022, a 911 dispatcher in the quiet suburban enclave of Northwood County received a call that was both chillingly calm and utterly terrifying. The digital clock on her console read 9:47 p.m. as she answered with the practiced, steady tone required of her profession. The voice that responded was a hushed whisper, a thread of sound so thin it was almost lost in the sterile hum of the call center. The voice on the line belonged to Amelia Hayes, a 28-year-old architect known for her vibrant personality and meticulous nature. She was reporting what she believed to be an intruder in her 2-story colonial home on Maple Crest Drive. But what the dispatcher did not know, what no one could have known in that moment, was that the person Amelia feared was not some random stranger trying to get in. The source of the sounds that had alarmed her was already inside her home, moving with a familiarity that defied the very concept of intrusion. How could a place of safety, a home she had so carefully built and curated, become the stage for such a calculated and intimate act of betrayal? The dispatcher, a woman named Linda Royce, leaned forward, her training kicking in to override the cold spike of fear she felt for the woman on the other end. She instructed Amelia to stay on the line and to keep whispering. Amelia explained that she had been upstairs in her home office, finalizing a blueprint for a client, when she heard a noise from the first floor. It was not the familiar creak of the old house settling. It was a distinct, soft thud, as if something heavy had been gently set down on the hardwood floor of the living room. Linda typed rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she relayed the address and the nature of the call to the patrol units. She asked Amelia if she was alone in the house. Amelia confirmed she was. Her fiancé, Ethan, was away on a business trip in a neighboring state, not due back for another 2 days. This piece of information was delivered with the same quiet, factual tone as the rest, a simple statement of her solitude. Amelia then described another sound, the faint squeak of a floorboard in the central hallway downstairs. It was a specific sound she knew well, one she heard every morning when she walked from the kitchen to the front door. Hearing it now, while she was isolated on the second floor, sent a fresh wave of panic through her, though her voice remained remarkably controlled. She told Linda she had locked the bedroom door and was hiding in the walk-in closet, her back pressed against a row of clothes. The dispatcher tried to keep her talking, asking about the layout of the house to provide more information to the responding officers. Amelia described the staircase, its position relative to the front door, and the location of the master bedroom where she was now concealed. Every detail she provided was a testament to her architectural mind, precise and clear, even under duress. Linda could hear the faint, muffled sound of Amelia's own breathing, quick and shallow, punctuated by the agonizing silence between each new sound from downstairs. Officers David Chen and Marcus Thorne were only 3 minutes away when the call came over their radio. A possible home invasion in progress on Maple Crest Drive, a notoriously quiet and affluent part of their patrol zone. The dispatcher's voice was tense as she relayed that the homeowner was on the line, hiding upstairs. That single detail changed everything, elevating the call from a routine property crime check to a high-stakes, life-or-death scenario. Officer Chen, who was driving, accelerated smoothly, but did not activate the siren. They wanted to approach with an element of surprise, a standard procedure designed not to alert a potential suspect and provoke a hostage situation or a violent confrontation. The flashing lights were also kept off until they were just a block away, their silent red and blue strobes painting the autumn leaves of the maple trees that lined the street. They pulled up 50 yards from the address, parking the patrol car behind a large SUV parked on the street. They killed the engine and the lights, plunging their immediate surroundings back into the typical suburban darkness. From their vantage point, the house looked perfectly normal. Lights were on in a downstairs window and one on the second floor, casting a warm, inviting glow that stood in stark contrast to the terrifying reality unfolding within. The two officers exited their vehicle, their movements practiced and silent. They unholstered their service weapons, holding them in a low-ready position as they used the shadows and manicured shrubbery for cover. As they approached the front porch, they noted that there were no signs of forced entry. The front door was closed and appeared undamaged. The windows were all intact, and a decorative pumpkin sat undisturbed by the welcome mat. Officer Thorne circled around to the back of the house, while Officer Chen remained at the front. Thorne's voice came over the radio a moment later, low and tight. The back door, a sliding glass door that led to a stone patio, was slightly ajar. It was not forced open. It was simply unlocked and open by a few inches. A silent invitation into the home. This was the first detail that felt wrong, a subtle inconsistency in the narrative of a violent break-in. Back at the dispatch center, Linda Royce was still on the line with Amelia. She was trying to offer words of reassurance, telling her that officers were on the scene and were approaching the house. Suddenly, Amelia went quiet. Linda called her name, first softly, then with growing urgency. There was no response. The line was still open, but the only sound was a dead, empty static. A moment later, a new sound came through the line, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of a door handle turning, followed by the soft click of a lock disengaging. Then the line went dead. The call was disconnected. Linda stared at her console, her heart pounding. She immediately relayed the information to the officers on the scene. She had lost contact with the caller after hearing what sounded like a door opening. With the confirmation that the back door was ajar and the sudden loss of contact with the victim, the officers' protocol shifted. This was now an active and immediate threat. They made the decision to enter. Officer Thorne slid the glass door open and stepped inside, his weapon raised, with Officer Chen following directly behind him. They announced their presence loudly. "Northwood Police, show yourself." The only response was the deep, unnerving silence of the house. The interior of the home was immaculate. The living room was tastefully decorated, with books stacked neatly on a coffee table and throw pillows arranged perfectly on the sofa. There were no overturned lamps, no drawers pulled out, no signs of the chaos typically associated with a burglary. The officers moved methodically, clearing the first floor room by room, the kitchen, the dining room, a small study. Everything was in its place. They advanced to the staircase, their feet silent on the plush runner. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before them. Several doors led off to guest rooms and a bathroom. One door at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar. As they approached, they could see it was the master bedroom. It was the room Amelia had told the dispatcher she was hiding in. Officer Chen pushed the door open slowly. The scene that greeted them was one of profound stillness. The room was cast in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Amelia Hayes was lying on the floor next to the bed. It was immediately clear that she was beyond help. There was no sign of a struggle in the room itself. Like the rest of the house, it was orderly and undisturbed, except for the tragic, solitary figure on the floor. The officers secured the room, their training forcing them to push past the immediate shock and focus on procedure. They checked for a pulse they knew they would not find and confirmed the victim was deceased. A quick scan of the immediate area revealed no weapon and no suspect. They backed out of the room, careful not to disturb anything, and immediately radioed for detectives and the crime scene unit. Maple Crest Drive was no longer just a quiet street. It was now the location of a homicide. Detective Frank Miller arrived on the scene 20 minutes later. He was a veteran of the Northwood Homicide Division, a man whose weary eyes had seen more than their share of human tragedy. He received the initial briefing from Officer Chen, who recounted the details of the 911 call, the discovery of the unlocked back door, and the pristine condition of the house. Miller listened intently, his mind already cataloging the inconsistencies. A burglary gone wrong was the most obvious theory, but it felt thin from the start. Burglars were typically after property, not confrontation. They were messy, driven by speed and opportunity. This scene felt different. It felt clean, controlled, and personal. The lack of forced entry suggested the perpetrator either had a key or was let into the house. The unlocked back door could have been a point of entry, or it could have been a deliberate piece of misdirection. Miller walked the perimeter of the house himself before entering. He noted the tidy landscaping, the absence of any footprints in the soft soil of the flower beds beneath the windows. He saw no pry marks on any of the window frames. Everything pointed to a quiet, seamless entry and exit. The killer had moved with confidence and familiarity. A ghost who knew the layout of the house and how to move within it without causing a disturbance. Inside, the crime scene unit had already begun their painstaking work. The house was now a grid of methodical investigation, with every surface treated as a potential source of evidence. Photographers captured the scene from every conceivable angle, their flashes illuminating the silent rooms in stark, repetitive bursts. Forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits moved slowly, dusting for fingerprints on doorknobs, light switches, and countertops. In the master bedroom, the focus was intense. The lead forensic investigator, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, directed her team with quiet precision. They took detailed measurements, noting the position of the victim's body in relation to the furniture. They collected fibers from the carpet and hairs that were almost invisible to the naked eye. Every item was carefully bagged, tagged, and logged, creating a chain of custody that would be unshakable in court. The medical examiner arrived and conducted a preliminary examination of Amelia Hayes. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation. There were faint marks on her neck, but very few other signs of a physical fight. The lack of defensive wounds on her hands or arms was particularly troubling. It suggested she was either taken completely by surprise or was overpowered so quickly that she had no chance to defend herself. While the forensic team worked, Detective Miller began the parallel investigation, building a picture of the victim's life. Who was Amelia Hayes? Who were the people in her orbit? He knew from experience that in cases like this, the answer was rarely found in a random act of violence. The answer was almost always closer to home. He tasked a junior detective with the grim responsibility of notifying Amelia's next of kin. Amelia's parents, Robert and Carol Hayes, lived just 40 minutes away. They received the knock on their door shortly after midnight. The news of their daughter's death shattered the quiet of their suburban home, replacing it with a raw, disbelieving grief. Through their tears, they spoke to the detectives, describing their daughter as a beacon of light in their lives. She was ambitious and brilliant, but also kind and deeply compassionate. They told the detectives that Amelia was the happiest she had ever been. She loved her job, she had a close circle of friends, and she was deeply in love with her fiancé, Ethan Vance. They had gotten engaged just 6 months prior and were in the midst of planning a wedding for the following summer. The family described Ethan as charming, attentive, and completely devoted to their daughter. They could not think of a single person who would want to harm Amelia. The task of informing Ethan fell to Detective Miller himself. He reached him via the cell phone number Amelia's parents provided. When Miller identified himself and delivered the news, there was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. It was followed by a choked, guttural sound of anguish. Ethan's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated horror and grief. He told the detective he would get in his car and start driving back immediately. While waiting for Ethan to arrive, investigators continued to process the scene and the victim's life. They took Amelia's laptop from her home office and her personal phone, which they eventually found tucked away in a drawer, not on her person or in the closet where she had been hiding. This was another strange detail. Why would her phone not be with her, especially when she was trying to call for help? The 911 call had been made from the landline phone in the bedroom. They also discovered that Amelia's wallet and her car keys were missing from her purse, which had been left on the kitchen counter. The car itself, a late-model sedan, was still parked in the garage. The missing items lent some credence to the burglary theory, but it felt forced. A thief who took a wallet and keys, but left behind an expensive laptop, several pieces of art, and a high-end television was not a typical burglar. It felt like a performance, a deliberate attempt to stage the scene. Ethan Vance arrived at the Northwood police station in the early hours of the morning, his face pale and his eyes red-rimmed from crying. He was a handsome, well-dressed man who worked in finance, and he projected an air of confident success that was now completely undone by grief. In his initial interview with Detective Miller, he was cooperative, though visibly distraught. He recounted his love for Amelia, their plans for the future, and his total shock that anyone could do this to her. He provided a detailed account of his alibi. He had driven to a conference in a city 3 hours away the previous morning. He checked into his hotel, attended a networking dinner, and had spent the entire evening there. He said he had spoken to Amelia on the phone around 7 p.m., just before he went to the dinner. He said she sounded happy and normal. They had talked about their day and said goodnight. That was the last time he had spoken to her. His alibi appeared solid, almost airtight. He provided the name of the hotel, the conference organizers, and the colleagues he had been with. A preliminary check confirmed his story. Hotel records showed he checked in when he said he did. His credit card had been used at the hotel restaurant. On the surface, Ethan Vance was exactly what he appeared to be. A devastated fiancé who was hundreds of miles away when the love of his life was murdered. With Ethan's alibi seemingly confirmed, the investigation turned its focus back to the burglary theory and the search for other potential suspects. Detectives began the laborious process of canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on every door on Maple Crest Drive and the surrounding streets. They asked residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual the previous night. Most had not. The neighborhood was quiet, and people kept to themselves. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the street, did offer a small piece of information. She said that around 9:30 p.m., she had seen a dark-colored sedan she did not recognize parked halfway down the block from Amelia's house. She could not provide a make or model, and she did not see anyone get in or out of the vehicle. It was a vague lead, but it was all they had. The search for Amelia's missing wallet and keys also proved fruitless. Investigators checked dumpsters and storm drains within a several-mile radius of her home, hoping the killer had discarded them nearby. They flagged her credit cards, but there was no activity on any of them after her death. The items had simply vanished, deepening the mystery of the killer's motive and methods. As the initial days of the investigation turned into a week, the forensic reports began to come back from the lab. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. The crime scene had been wiped remarkably clean. While the technicians had lifted dozens of partial fingerprints from the house, most of them belonged to Amelia or Ethan. The few unidentified prints were too smudged to be useful for a match in the national database. More importantly, there was no foreign DNA found on Amelia's body or at the scene. No skin cells under her fingernails, no stray hairs, no saliva. The killer had been incredibly careful, likely wearing gloves and taking great pains not to leave any biological trace behind. This level of forensic awareness was rare in a common burglar. It suggested a perpetrator who was methodical, patient, and understood how modern investigations worked. The autopsy report confirmed the cause of death as strangulation and provided a more precise time of death, estimated between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. This aligned perfectly with the timeline of Amelia's 911 call. The medical examiner also noted the lack of any other injuries, reinforcing the theory that she had been ambushed and quickly subdued. The killer had used just enough force to end her life, but no more. It was an act of cold, efficient violence. With the forensic evidence providing no clear leads, Detective Miller decided to dig deeper into Amelia's personal and professional life. Perhaps her parents and fiancé were unaware of some hidden conflict. It was during this phase of the investigation that a potential new suspect emerged, a classic red herring that would consume valuable time and resources. Detectives interviewed Amelia's colleagues at the architectural firm where she worked. Most described her in glowing terms: talented, dedicated, and a pleasure to work with. However, one name came up repeatedly in a more negative light: Mark Renshaw. Mark was a senior architect at the firm who had been Amelia's direct competitor for a recent promotion to a partner-level position. Amelia had gotten the promotion just 2 months before her death. According to their colleagues, Mark had not taken the decision well. He had been openly bitter, complaining to others that he was more experienced and more deserving of the position. One colleague reported hearing Mark make a resentful comment about Amelia getting everything she wanted just a week before the murder. While it was far from a motive for murder, it was a clear source of conflict. When detectives brought Mark Renshaw in for an interview, he was immediately defensive and hostile. He was a man with a palpable sense of grievance, and he did not try to hide his dislike for Amelia. He admitted he was angry about the promotion, but he scoffed at the idea that he would have harmed her. He claimed it was just office politics. His alibi for the night of the murder was weak. He said he had been at a sports bar by himself, watching a game. He had paid in cash, so there were no credit card receipts to verify his location. He could not name the bartender or any other patrons who could corroborate his story. His evasiveness and his clear animosity toward the victim made him a person of interest. For the next 2 weeks, the investigation focused heavily on Mark Renshaw. Detectives executed a search warrant on his apartment and his car. They found nothing to connect him to the crime. They subpoenaed his phone records, which showed he had been in the general vicinity of the bar he claimed to have been at. But the cell tower data was not precise enough to give him a concrete alibi. They re-interviewed his friends and family, trying to find a crack in his story. They learned he had a history of a bad temper and had been in a few verbal altercations in the past, but there was no record of physical violence. Mark Renshaw fit the profile of a man with a motive and a flimsy alibi, but there was not a single piece of physical evidence to link him to the crime scene on Maplecrest Drive. The break in the case against Mark came from an unexpected source. A bartender from the sports bar, who had been on vacation, returned to work and saw a news report about the case that featured Mark's photo. He contacted the police and confirmed that he remembered seeing Mark at the bar on the night of the murder. He said Mark had been there for several hours, sitting alone at the end of the bar, and had not left until after 11 p.m. With his alibi suddenly solidified, Mark Renshaw was cleared as a suspect. The investigation was now back at square one. The burglary theory was all but dead, and their only other person of interest had been cleared. Detective Miller felt a growing sense of frustration. The case was growing cold, and the pressure from the media and Amelia's family was mounting. He kept coming back to the same troubling elements: the clean crime scene, the lack of forced entry, and the staged feeling of the missing items. He decided to take another look at the person closest to the victim, her fiancé, Ethan Vance. His alibi was perfect, almost too perfect. Miller assigned 2 detectives to reconstruct Ethan's business trip from start to finish, not just to confirm his story, but to actively search for any inconsistencies, no matter how small. They were to re-interview everyone he had seen, re-verify every transaction, and re-examine every piece of data. The detectives traveled to the neighboring state and went to the hotel where Ethan had stayed. They confirmed with the front desk staff that he had checked in. They spoke to the conference organizers, who verified his attendance at the evening dinner. They interviewed the colleagues he had named, all of whom remembered seeing him and speaking with him at the event. Everything checked out. Ethan Vance, it seemed, was exactly where he said he was. The months began to pass. The case file for Amelia Hayes' murder grew thicker with dead-end leads and negative lab reports. The initial flurry of media attention died down, replaced by occasional anniversary pieces that retold the story of the brilliant young architect murdered in her own home. For Amelia's family, the passage of time brought no relief, only a deepening of their grief and a gnawing uncertainty. Detective Miller kept the case file on his desk long after it should have been moved to the cold case archives. He would periodically reread the reports, hoping to see something he had missed. The image of the pristine crime scene and the memory of Ethan Vance's polished grief stuck with him. He had a detective's intuition, a gut feeling that he could not shake, that the answer was right in front of him, hidden in plain sight. The case remained officially dormant for nearly a full year. The trail had gone completely cold. The Northwood Police Department had exhausted all available leads. It seemed that the murder of Amelia Hayes was destined to become one of those tragic, unsolved cases that haunt a community for decades. But then, a single phone call changed everything. The call came into the station's non-emergency line on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 14 months after Amelia's death. The woman on the phone was hesitant, her voice trembling. She said she had information about the Amelia Hayes case. She identified herself as Dr. Alicia Singh, a pediatrician from a neighboring city. She told the operator she needed to speak with the lead detective on the case. Detective Miller took the call in his office. Dr. Singh explained that she had dated Ethan Vance for 2 years, long before he had met Amelia. Their relationship had ended amicably, but they had remained loosely in touch. She said that a few months after Amelia's murder, Ethan had reached out to her, claiming he was lonely and looking to reconnect with old friends. She had felt sorry for him and had agreed to meet him for a drink. They met several times over the next few months. During one of their meetings, Ethan, who had had too much to drink, began talking about Amelia. He became emotional, but his grief, she said, seemed to curdle into something else, something colder. He started talking about the pressures of his life, about financial problems he had been having, and about how Amelia had been an obstacle. Then, he had said something that had chilled her to the bone. He had slurred the words, but she remembered them clearly. He said, "Everyone thought it was a robbery. I planned everything perfectly. You have to be smart about it. You have to get rid of a problem without anyone knowing it was you." He had sobered up quickly after that, realizing what he had said, and tried to laugh it off as a morbid, drunken fantasy. But she had seen the look in his eyes, a flash of something cold and calculating. Dr. Singh admitted she had been terrified. She had cut off all contact with Ethan immediately after that night. She had been too scared to come to the police, afraid that he would come after her, and she had no concrete proof, only the ramblings of a drunk man. But, she said, her conscience had been eating away at her ever since. She had finally worked up the courage to make the call. This was the breakthrough Detective Miller had been waiting for. It was not hard evidence, but it was a powerful catalyst. It gave him the justification he needed to reopen the investigation with a singular focus, proving that Ethan Vance was a liar and a killer. He immediately assembled his team and laid out a new plan of attack. They were no longer trying to find a random killer. They were working to dismantle a seemingly perfect alibi. The first step was to take a much deeper dive into Ethan's finances. The initial review had shown he was well employed, but it had been superficial. This time, they subpoenaed every financial record they could get their hands on. bank statements, credit card bills, loan applications, investment portfolios, everything dating back 5 years. A forensic accountant was brought in to analyze the data. The picture that emerged was shocking. Ethan Vance was living a life built on a mountain of debt and deception. He had lost a significant amount of money in a series of bad investments 2 years prior, a fact he had hidden from everyone, including Amelia. He was deep in debt to credit card companies and had taken out several high-interest personal loans. He was juggling payments, barely staying afloat, and his income was not nearly enough to support his lavish lifestyle. The forensic accountant discovered that Ethan had been siphoning money from a joint savings account he shared with Amelia, making small, regular withdrawals that he had hoped she would not notice. But she had. Emails recovered from Amelia's laptop showed that in the weeks leading up to her murder, she had started questioning him about the missing funds. The tone of the emails grew increasingly concerned and confrontational. The last email she had sent him on the subject, just 4 days before her death, demanded a full accounting of their finances before they moved forward with their wedding plans. On top of his own financial ruin, investigators learned something crucial about Amelia's finances. She had a substantial life insurance policy taken out by her employer with a payout of $1 million. 6 months before her murder, right after they got engaged, Amelia had named Ethan Vance as the sole beneficiary. Suddenly, the motive was crystal clear. Ethan was not just facing financial ruin, he was on the verge of losing Amelia, his financial lifeline. Her death would solve all of his problems in one fell swoop. With the motive firmly established, Miller's team turned their attention back to the alibi. They knew he was physically present at the conference dinner, but was he there the entire night? They re-interviewed the attendees, this time with more pointed questions. One colleague, after much thought, recalled something odd. He remembered speaking with Ethan early in the evening, but he did not see him again after about 8 p.m. He had assumed Ethan had just turned in early. This was a potential crack in the timeline. The drive from the conference hotel to Northwood was approximately 3 hours. If Ethan had left at 8 p.m., he could have arrived at his and Amelia's home around 11 p.m., which was too late. Amelia was killed between 9:30 and 10 p.m. The timeline still did not work. But Miller suspected Ethan was smarter than that. The key, Miller believed, lay in digital forensics. He subpoenaed Ethan's phone records again, but this time he also requested the records for all cell phones that had been purchased and activated in Ethan's area in the months leading up to the murder. It was a massive data dump, a fishing expedition of the highest order. But buried within that data was the key to the entire case. They found a record of a prepaid burner phone, purchased with cash from a convenience store 2 months before the murder. The phone was activated a week later. There was no subscriber name attached to it, but the investigators were able to get the phone's activity records from the service provider. There were only a handful of calls ever made from the phone, all to taxi services and disposable email account providers. The next step was to get the cell tower location data for this burner phone. They cross-referenced its location with the location of Ethan's known personal cell phone. On the night of the murder, the data told a damning story. Ethan's personal phone remained at the hotel in the neighboring state all evening, pinging off the local cell tower, creating a perfect digital alibi. But the burner phone's data painted a very different picture. At 7:30 p.m., the burner phone began moving. It traveled south, away from the conference city, along the interstate highway that led directly to Northwood. The cell tower pings created a digital breadcrumb trail, tracking the phone's journey. The phone arrived in the Northwood area around 9:15 p.m. It remained in the vicinity of Maple Crest Drive for approximately 1 hour, and then it began moving again, traveling back north along the same highway. It arrived back in the conference city in the early hours of the morning. Ethan had orchestrated a sophisticated deception. He had left his personal phone in his hotel room to create a digital footprint that placed him far from the crime scene. He then used a second, untraceable car, likely a rental paid for with cash or borrowed, and the burner phone to travel to Northwood, commit the murder, and return, all under the cover of darkness and anonymity. He had likely parked the car a few blocks away, which would explain the neighbor's sighting of an unfamiliar sedan. He had walked to his own home, and because he had a key, he was able to let himself in without any force. The unlocked back door was a deliberate plant, a piece of staging designed to make it look like a break-in. He knew Amelia would be working in her office. He waited downstairs, making just enough noise to alarm her, causing her to call 911. He knew the police would be dispatched, so he was on a timer. He went upstairs and confronted her. The exact details of their final conversation will never be known, but it likely involved the money and her discovery of his deceit. He overpowered her and killed her, quickly and quietly. He then took her wallet and keys to complete the illusion of a robbery. He walked out the back door, leaving it ajar, and disappeared back into the night, driving back to his hotel and slipping back into his room before dawn. He had thought of everything. Armed with this mountain of new evidence, the financial motive, the witness testimony from his ex-girlfriend, and the damning cell tower data from the burner phone, Detective Miller finally had what he needed. He brought Ethan Vance back to the same interview room where he had played the part of the grieving fiancé more than a year earlier. This time, the tone was different. Miller did not ask questions. He laid out the evidence piece by piece on the table between them. He started with the secret debts and the life insurance policy. He moved on to the emails from Amelia, her growing suspicion. Then he presented the phone records, showing the two cell phones moving in opposite directions. He saved the burner phone's journey for last, showing a map with the cell tower pings, creating a direct route from his alibi to the scene of the crime. Ethan Vance's composure, so carefully maintained for more than a year, finally shattered. The color drained from his face. His confident facade crumbled, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a man whose intricate web of lies had just been completely unraveled. He initially tried to deny it, but the evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. He was placed under arrest for the murder of Amelia Hayes. The subsequent trial was a formality. The prosecution presented the case with the same methodical precision that Ethan had once used to plan his crime. The financial documents, the testimony from Dr. Singh, and the cell tower data from the burner phone, which the media dubbed the silent witness, wove a narrative of greed and betrayal that left the jury with no doubt. The defense had no credible counter-argument. Ethan Vance was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Amelia's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it could never bring closure. Their daughter was gone, murdered by the man she had loved and trusted, the man they had welcomed into their family. In a statement to the press after the trial, her father, Robert Hayes, spoke through his grief. He said that the real tragedy was not just the loss of his daughter, but the theft of her future, a future she had been so excited to build. He urged everyone to remember Amelia, not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, passion, and an unwavering belief in the good of others. The case of Amelia Hayes serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers do not always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from the people we let into our homes and our hearts. The people who wear masks of love and devotion to hide the cold calculations of greed and malice that lie beneath. It is a story of a meticulous plan for murder being unraveled by an equally meticulous investigation, and the tireless pursuit of truth for a victim who deserved so much more. The quiet, desperate 911 call she made that night was not just a cry for help. It was the first thread in a long and complicated story, a story that finally found its ending in a courtroom, with a final, somber judgment of accountability. The community of Northwood, once shaken by the brutal and seemingly random act of violence, was now left to grapple with a more disturbing truth. The monster was not an outsider who had breached their peaceful enclave. He was one of them, a man who had attended neighborhood barbecues and smiled at passers-by, all while harboring a secret so dark it was almost incomprehensible. The house on Maple Crest Drive, once a symbol of Amelia's success and dreams, stood as a silent monument to the profound and devastating consequences of a trust so completely and utterly betrayed. In the aftermath, Detective Miller and his team received commendations for their work, particularly for their tenacity in pursuing the case long after it had gone cold. Miller himself, however, found little satisfaction in the victory. For him, every solved case was a failure in some respect. A life that could not be saved. A family that could not be made whole again. He knew that for the Hayes family, the guilty verdict was merely the final chapter in a book of sorrow they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of Amelia's whispered voice on that 911 call would remain a haunting echo of a life extinguished far too soon. A final, desperate plea from a sanctuary that had become a tomb. If you found this case compelling, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. True crime stories like the one of Amelia Hayes are not just about the darkness of the act, but also about the dedicated pursuit of justice that follows. Turn on your notifications to stay updated on similar in-depth investigations that honor the victims by telling their complete story. Until next time, stay aware, stay compassionate, and look out for one another.